for our topic today, we couldn't have asked for a better end of the day discussion and a particular case study than the 1MDB case. This is, I'm going to prompt Tom. He wanted to do it as a conversation, so we're going to have this conversation. I see you in front of me, Tom. Thank you for being here. And I will just prompt Tom to tell us more. Tom right now has a media company called Project Brazen with his co-author on this book, Bradley Hope, who my students got the benefit of seeing because my class at 8 in the morning was actually midnight for Singapore. So fortunately, Bradley Hope is in London, and that worked out for my class. So we heard from his co-author, but now we get to hear from Tom Wright himself, who also has a story, if we get to it, that he followed and had a podcast on what's called Fat Leonard. Fat Leonard was a scandal, a corruption scandal in the US Navy. But because we're talking about transnational, global capitalism, we are going to focus, at least initially, on the 1MDB case. I discovered, as I told Tom the other day, that the story is not known by everybody. So we're going to start by bringing out everybody a little bit on to this amazing, spectacular story of 1MDB. I'd say that, and just like talking to people about cum-ex scandal, which we discussed in the book, a big tax fraud in Europe. Everybody gives me a stare like they don't know. So they should know because it is pretty spectacular, and so is this one. We will see everything that we discussed today and more in this story. So Tom, thank you so much and welcome to this end of the day for us, beginning of day for you time. Thanks so much for coming. Can you tell us the broad outline, the key issues, who's who in the 1MDB scandal that is, this book was 2018, and then we'll talk later about what went on since then.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And yeah, these scandals sound very unsexy, don't they? Cum-ex and 1MDB. It sounds like that thing you go on to find out what favorite actor was in what film or whatever. We shouldn't use the way we should pitch this as an elevator pitch is this is the biggest ever fraud. That's how I put it. And it's an amazing fraud. A guy called Jolo, and I'll just give you the 2-minute overview for those of you who don't know the story. This guy called Jolo was a Malaysian kid whose parents were also fraudsters. He came from a small island called Penang in the north of Malaysia, and his dad was a fraudster. His sister was a lawyer specializing in the BVI, so he came from that kind of world. And they sent him to Harrow and then to Wharton in the US, and with this sort of express goal of getting to know other rich and famous people. And he did that. He took a semester off from Wharton. He got to know very rich Arabs. He went to the Middle East, to the UAE specifically. And he figured out how in the UAE, there were these huge sovereign wealth funds that were being managed by very young, inexperienced people moving around billions of dollars. He got to know also when he was in England, when he was at Harrow School before Wharton, he got to know the Prime Minister of Malaysia's stepson. And so he put all that together, basically. He persuaded the Prime Minister of Malaysia to set up a sovereign wealth fund like the ones he'd seen in the Middle East. And they just did billions of dollars of deals. And it was pure daylight robbery. It's not like Bernie Madoff, who built a pyramid scheme over many years and really had a proper market-making business. This guy had no real business. It was all to do with government money that they raised on markets at a time of very low interest rates, famously with the help of Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs made loads of money helping this fund that they set up raise this cash, and they just pure stole it. Billions of dollars went missing. 6 to 7 billion is the minimum amount in this case. Jolo used the money to set up a Hollywood film company. He made the film The Wolf of Wall Street with Leonardo DiCaprio. He bought mansions across America. He bought EMI Music Publishing's Asia division, and he was actually setting himself up as a bona fide billionaire, giving interviews to the Wall Street Journal, where I used to work. And then it all came crashing down because they didn't pay off a few people. Some people stole computer servers, which had all the evidence of the fraud. And that was about a decade ago, 2015. We reported that in the Wall Street Journal, and others in Malaysia broke the news. And then, the unraveling happened, which, led to a Goldman partner called Tim Leissner pleading guilty to helping steal $200 million. He's still not gone to jail. The Prime Minister of Malaysia going to jail over this for sort of overseeing the whole thing. He's still in jail. And then the perpetrator, Jolo, going on the run, and he's still not been found. So we can pick over, what all this means for the global financial system and its successes and failures in the aftermath of this. I think it's very interesting to the subject of your conference.
Yeah, so essentially this, I want to read maybe from one of your final comments here about this, because it's very much with the epilogue of your book. It's tempting to see this kind of corruption as a disease affecting poor countries, where kleptocrats live in splendor at the expense of their long-suffering populations. But Jolo crime is a modern take on that old story. The money he took, by and large, was not stolen directly from Malaysia's treasury or through padded government contracts. Instead, it was cash that one MDB borrowed on international financial markets with the help of Goldman Sachs. So the money was moving around, and then obviously the kinds of structure that we just talked about in the last panel were playing a role in that. So maybe you can give us a little bit of the flavor of all the different entities and all the different banks. So Goldman Sachs was a big player, $600 million in fees, and I want you also to talk about the top level versus the bad apples of Goldman Sachs and what this was really ultimately about. Who was involved in Goldman Sachs? Who were the other banks that were enabling to, so we understand more how this worked out.
Well, as you said, this fraud couldn't have happened just because Malaysia is a corrupt place and the Malaysian Prime Minister is very corrupt, and it all happened there. That, of course, was needed for this fraud to happen. But yeah, there were tons of enablers, including Goldman Sachs being the most, Goldman Sachs ended up paying the biggest ever fine under the FCPA in America for this fraud. Just to set the scene, this is happening in 2009 onwards. So it's after the global financial crisis. Goldman's just been dinged for, selling subprime mortgages to orphans and widows, which one of their bankers famously was caught saying, they paid fines there. It was embarrassing. But the US was in recession. The emerging markets out in Asia, where I live, were doing very well. And so Lloyd Blankfein, who was CEO, was very supportive of this business that they had, which was to try to do more in the East. And when Jolo came along, and he was looking to raise money for this fund. So the money they stole didn't exist. This was money that they borrowed, and it was an incredibly low interest rate environment. And so he went along to Goldman Sachs. He got to know this banker called Timothy Leissner, who was a German national, a partner at Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong and then Singapore. And Jolo persuaded him to take part in basically the fraud. Leissner has admitted now to stealing helping steal 200 million to pay bribes to Malaysian officials and others. And Goldman raised these bonds on the market for the 1MDB fund, which ostensibly was going to invest in green energy and do various projects for Malaysia. And it was called 1MDB. It was One Malaysia. It was supposed to improve the country. But they just stole the money. They never really did anything at all. They bought a few coal-fired power plants. And Goldman made 10% on the bonds. And this was an outrage to other bankers in the region, because normally if you sell government bonds, it's not a very risky business. You should just make a percent or so, or even less. And they made $600 million. And so that's actually how the Wall Street Journal got onto it, because Gary Cohen, who was Lloyd Blankfein's number 2, then went to work for the Trump administration, was showing off about this in New York at a lunch with a Wall Street Journal reporter, because they were making so much money in Malaysia. And Lloyd Blankfein was telling bankers around the world, do what Tim's doing. This is great. But, Goldman's view of this in terms of the enablers is that, well, Timothy Leissner was a bad apple. He was very corrupt. There was another banker called Roger Ng, a Malaysian, who's gone to jail over this in the US and been extradited back to Malaysia. Tim Leissner hasn't gone to jail yet. He's in the US cooperating and waiting sentencing. But my view is that everybody knew really what was going on at Goldman, and I've seen the emails to prove it, and it's you can read it in the book. Even after 1MDB, Goldman continued to do business with Jolo in the Middle East because it was so lucrative. And it's all about kind of covering yourself, making sure that it looks okay, making sure you don't directly represent him, that kind of thing. But they made huge amounts of money out of this over a long, long period of time. And they're just one of the many enablers in this story.
What about the other banks that he used, or other, how did he move the money around? You know, pretending to be somebody else, all that stuff.
Well, he doesn't really, well, yeah, they use a lot of shell companies to move money with ridiculous names, like, looks like Blackstone, but really it's some different company. So they use a lot of shell companies with names like that. They use a lot of BVI companies, bearer share companies, you know, where if you hold the certificate, you're the owner, which has been outlawed now in a lot of places. But really, the way that money was moved and the way they got past compliance was always to cite the Prime Minister of Malaysia to say, look, this is a government-backed enterprise. And although politically exposed people are supposed to be given more scrutiny, in the 1MDB case at least, it was used to railroad very junior people in compliance. You can see transcripts in the DOJ investigations where a Deutsche Bank woman is trying to say, look, why are you moving hundreds of millions? I don't understand what this is for. And somebody says, well, look, do you want me to get the Prime Minister of Malaysia on the line? So they use that kind of thing a lot to get stuff through. Jolo actually took over a private bank in Singapore called BSI. It was a Swiss bank that was basically failing under, you know, the stricter rules in Switzerland about private banking. It had moved out to Singapore to try to get more clients. He took it over basically and was able to move money how he wanted. He used all kinds of weird offshore entities to move money. There are these things that look like mutual funds that somebody ran for him that weren't really mutual funds. The money went in and out, and he could do what he wanted with them, and it looked like mutual funds, stuff like that. And yeah, they moved around hundreds and hundreds of millions. They used law firms in the US, Shearman and Sterling, set up accounts for them that were supposed to be lawfare accounts that they moved money through. They used real estate. They washed money through Christie's, and they also moved a lot of money through nightclubs, spending, you know, tens of millions a night, you know, on Cristal champagne, and that was more for fun, but also it's a way of moving money as well, because, you know, then the nightclub owner would buy Jolo a Bugatti or something like that for his birthday. So that's a sort of round tripping kind of money laundering as well, in my view. So all those enablers in the West, lots of them got away with it. Lots of celebrities were paid, you know, millions and millions of dollars. Jamie Foxx, Alicia Keys' husband, Swizz Beatz, Leonardo DiCaprio, who starred in a film that Wolf of Wall Street, that Jolo funded. He was given Picassos as gifts and stuff like that. Lots of that went back to the Department of Justice in the end, but, you know, the money was flowing in every direction. So
in one of the last chapters of the book is entitled Glass Half Full. And now it's 7 years since the book. So where is the cup today?
Well, at the time, you know, you could, or soon after the book came out, you could argue it was half full, right? And Bill McMurray, who was the Department of Justice lead on this, who's now left the service, he saw it as glass half full, and that's you know, the name of the chapter. Goldman paid the largest fine in FCPA history at that time, around, I think, $3 billion, including SEC fines as well. And then it paid another 2.5 billion in cash to Malaysia. So its total fines were about $7 billion. So if you're looking at the glass and you're saying, okay, is this enough of a deterrent to stop this happening again? After the global financial crisis, you know, famously, nobody went to jail for subprime. I think maybe one junior Credit Suisse banker. And so people started to say, look, this is not bad. You know, it's $7 billion. I think that was 80% of Goldman's net profit the year before. So it was material. They clawed back money from Lloyd Blankfein and others. So it hurt, you know. I guess the next year, Goldman made its record profits of 20-something billion. And so you can also say this is just a cost of doing business. And that's where the glass half empty element starts to come in, right? And now, years later, I'm definitely in the glass half empty camp, because Timothy Lysander's partner, who's pleaded guilty to stealing 200 million, hasn't gone to jail. He's still cooperating. We don't really know why he hasn't been sentenced yet. His junior, Roger Ng, was given 10 years in a US court and then extradited back to Malaysia. Goldman is now fighting with the Malaysian government over some of the elements of the I think 3.9 billion fine that it was given there, and it hasn't paid some of it, and it has responsibility to its shareholders to do a good bargain and not pay all that money. And nobody's really gone to jail from the higher ups there. And unless you have C-suite people going to jail, in my view, it's just not enough of a deterrent. Then, of course, and I'm sure you've talked about this at your conference, what's happening, the FCPA is basically suspended in the US at the moment since February as the Trump administration reviews stuff. I don't think that really affects 1MDB because I think all of that is done. But, they're not going to be rushing to do new cases. And this is obviously a very important law that stops foreign companies bribing foreign officials. It's very attractive for foreign companies going back to Siemens and Ericsson and others who've been fined under the FCPA to go abroad, especially to Asia, to countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and China even. JP Morgan 10 years ago was fined 250 million for the Sons and Daughters program, where it hired Chinese officials, kids, in a quid pro quo. But as you and I were talking, Anna, there's this narrowing definition of corruption in the US as well with the former Florida governor. And, you can see that I think if I was a company now operating in emerging markets, I wouldn't be worried too much if I, needed to pay a bribe or two quietly to get business. The deterrent is less, for sure. It's a glass half empty.
Yeah, and there's also the kleptocracy task force that is sort of also stopped because that's where they would try to collect still and forfeit and return to Malaysia some of the assets that were sort of...
Yeah. The fact that the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative has been disbanded is talking all the time to people who were involved in that. It's a catastrophe because, that was set up in 2011, I think, under the Obama administration, with this idea that you should prosecute foreign corrupt governments and that put their assets, that put their ill-gotten gains into U.S. assets. Because obviously, if you're a foreign corrupter, you want to buy that Beverly Hills mansion and then, seize that and send it back to the countries. One of the biggest ones was 1MDB, of course, and there was also Sani Abacha in Nigeria, who'd stolen, hundreds of millions of dollars in the 90s. And it takes a long time for that money to go back because you have to, in Nigeria's case, they're sending it back into infrastructure projects where they make sure that it's not being corrupted again, right? And it's taken a long time. So getting rid of that initiative, there were specialized people in the Department of Justice, in Main Justice, who were important for making that. The SCPA, by the way, still exists as a law. It's been suspended, not disbanded. It's not like it's been struck off. But without the people with years of experience in Main Justice to help push these things through, then it's just it's difficult enough anyway. And I think now it's really just gonna move very, very slowly. And I can't see many huge new cases happening. So, if you're a foreign company that wants to bribe, or if you're a foreign government that wants to, do corrupt things and then move the money into the States, it's kind of open season again, I'd say. And just as an aside, one of the reasons that the Kleptocracy Initiative, in my view, has been disbanded is because it ended up investigating into a lot of people that were quite close to Trump, including a character called Elliot Broidy. Elliot Broidy was a guy, he was connected into the casino world, and he had his own consulting company. When Jolo was indicted in the U.S., Elliot Broidy, so we should talk about Jolo. He went on the run, and he's living in China now. And Elliot Broidy was helping Jolo to try to get rid of the charges against him in the U.S., the indictment. And because of the Kleptocracy Initiative, Elliot Broidy ended up getting indicted himself for illegal representation for Jolo in the U.S. political system without registering. And he was pardoned by Trump, Broidy. But these kinds of figures have been caught up in the work of the DOJ under the Kleptocracy Initiative, and that's one of the reasons I believe that. And this has been reported by the Washington Post as well. It's one of the reasons why Trump was so keen to get rid of it.
So you mentioned the Jolo is in China. What's that about?
This is to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, China's very corrupt Marshall Plan equivalent. So when Jolo was first sort of named in the media and then indicted in the US and also in Malaysia and Singapore and other places, Najib was still in power. He was still the prime minister of Malaysia. And he said, look, get out of Malaysia. It's too hot here. So he went over to China, where he was kind of in hiding, but also his patron, the prime minister, was still in power. And so he negotiated all these corrupt infrastructure deals that China would fund in Malaysia, railroads, that kind of thing. And they padded those contracts as well. They were looking to fill the holes from the 1MDB fraud because so many billions had gone missing. By the way, Najib didn't really understand the full fraud. Jolo was the puppet master. Najib got his political slush funds from this. His wife, Rosma, who's this Imelda Marcos-like figure, she got her jewelry and all of this. But they didn't realize the billions that Jolo had stolen. They didn't realize, for example, that they were making Hollywood films with the money. And so they did these corrupt, padded railroad deals in Malaysia. China loved this because it was also a way of becoming more powerful in the South China Sea, in a country which is, Malaysia's traditionally been closer to the US. Xi Jinping was even negotiating with Najib to get berthing rights for the PLA Navy in Malaysia. And they realized that, Malaysia was in a hard spot. So when Najib lost power in an election, soon after all of this, he considered, calling on the military and ending democracy in Malaysia, but he didn't, and he went to jail. The new government got hold of all the documents from his office that showed the corruption of these Belt and Road deals. The Malaysians had taken minutes of this. And since then, Jolo's been in China under house arrest because the last thing China wants is for, this corruption involved very, very senior Chinese level officials, including the Minister of Trade and Industry, the head of domestic security. All of those people have subsequently been arrested in China and are in jail on corruption charges. They never say why, but we know it's because of 1MDB. So to send Jolo back to Malaysia now from China would be a huge embarrassment for the Chinese government because he would then, he knows where the bodies are buried. He knows how utterly corrupt the Belt and Road Initiative is, across the world, in Africa, Sri Lanka, other places. He was one of their useful billionaires. And so they don't really want him out in public talking about stuff. So he's there. We've run these whereas Jolo campaigns, crowdsourcing, and we've gotten photos of him at like Shanghai Disneyland with his minders in the background and various places. But even last week, I heard from a source that he's in China. So, but we're not really that optimistic we'll ever hear from him at least in the short term.
Okay, so I'm going to just take a few more minutes and then open it up if people have questions. Maybe you can spend about 5 minutes or so telling us a little bit about Fat Leonard Scandal.
Yeah, well, there's a running theme between all of these things. So my company, Project Brazen, we create podcasts and books and magazine articles about stories that then we can adapt for TV and film. And the first podcast we did was about this character, Fat Leonard, who was a bit like an Eric Prince type character. He was a contractor for the US military. So after, in the last 20 years with huge military spending, he benefited from that. What he would do is a ship would come into port anywhere in the Asia Pacific. You're talking about the $2 billion aircraft carriers. And he would put on fuel, he would take off, the water. He would even do security for them after the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen around September the 11th. And what he did was he would charge, millions, tens of millions more than he should have done. And in return, he put on parties for Navy admirals, their wives, and officers. And it's a little bit grim, and excuse my language, but he would pay for prostitutes. He would pay for orgies involving multiple members of the Navy. It was a huge scandal. And then he would record these orgies with cameras in the karaoke machines in hotels across Asia as a kind of sexual compromat that he could use as leverage. And this went on for years and years. And the reason it went on for years was he was actually good at his job. And if you're the US Navy, you want to go into a corrupt country and berth your ship, you kind of need a bagman like Leonard to operate between you and it gets back to the FCPA in a way, right? This is why all these companies have paid bribes in the past because it's very hard to operate in certain countries without paying bribes. So the person who will pay the bribe will win, right? But the US Navy doesn't want to do it. So Leonard is the guy who deals with the port, sets it all up for the ship to come in. I mean, if it's Singapore, it's fine. It's not corrupt. But if it's Thailand, there's huge levels of corruption. And so Leonard did that for years. He even corrupted the NCIS, which is the investigative body of the Navy. He corrupted the chief officer in Quantico, in Virginia. So when the NCIS tried to investigate him, that guy was like stymieing it. And he was eventually brought down by a Navy spouse, a woman called Marcy Mishevitz, whose husband was also corrupt, who found out about it. And then they ended up setting up an off-the-books NCIS investigation to bring him down. So we're turning that into you can listen to the podcast. We smuggled a microphone to Leonard, who was in home arrest in San Diego. He eventually the off-the-books NCIS investigation lured him to San Diego. They arrested him. And then he was cooperating. He was in jail for a long time, home arrest with cancer. We smuggled a microphone to him, and the resulting podcast was our Fat Leonard podcast, which we're turning into a feature film at the moment, written by Pete Fiorelli, who wrote Crazy Rich Asians. So it's sort of like a dark comedy. But it's just when you've got defense spending of $700-800 billion a year, then this kind of thing happens, and it's just gravy, right? The guy who replaced Fat Leonard, by the way, when he went to jail, has also been arrested for corruption as well. So it's
there were all these
a mess.
Chapters there about how he escaped to Venezuela, and Biden traded him back last summer, and then he was tried in the U.S.
Oh yeah, so after the podcast, it was a big mistake for him to do the podcast, and you'll see that in the podcast, I'm actually charmed by him. Most of these characters, by the way, are very charming and persuasive. And then later on, you can see that he's such a sort of evil misogynist and then he cuts off his ankle bracelet after the podcast because he realizes that it's really hurt his status as a cooperating witness in the case of all these other Navy officers who were being tried. And he goes on the run to Mexico, and then he eventually gets to Venezuela, where he's rearrested boarding a flight for Russia. So he was trying to get to Russia, by the way, with top secret anti-ballistic missile defense information, ship schedules, and all the sexual compromise he has on admirals, including admirals who were, top-level admirals, some of whom were in line for, very, very senior positions in the U.S. Navy, and who were quietly pushed out, many of them without sanction. So there's this saying in the Navy, different spanks for different ranks. And a lot of the junior guys got jail time, but a lot of the senior admirals were just quietly.
So what happened to the top people in the Navy?
Yeah, just quietly pensioned off,
Yeah.
And it's no mystery why the U.S. Navy now has its first female leader in the U.S. Navy's history. That this is why they realized that they have to deal with this problem. It's a huge problem. These guys were going around Asia in the flagship of the 7th Fleet, the USS Blue Ridge, treating it like a party boat. Every time they went into a port like Manila or Bali or something. So it was a real stain on the U.S. Navy.
Pretty shocking story. Okay, so he's full of such juicy stories and insights. So if anybody has more questions for Tom, go for it. Peter.
Peter Solmson, formerly of Siemens. And you said something which worried me a little bit. You said there are some countries where you really can't do business without paying bribes. And that's not our experience, and I'm curious why you said that.
It's not Siemens' experience. Is that what you're saying?
I was at GE too. We got better at it. You just say no. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, but the notion you can't do business in certain countries, I don't think is true. I mean, it takes some resolve, it takes some time, it takes some money. It's not easy, but to say that it's impossible, I think is, at least in our experience, I'd say from 3 companies, not the case.
Yeah, maybe I came across as too cynical when I said that, and I take your point, right? I haven't got contracting experience like you do in places like Indonesia. I've lived in Indonesia for a long time, and I guess my comment is coming from a place where, I lived and worked for the Wall Street Journal for 4 or 5 years there in Indonesia and traveling around Southeast Asia. And the flow of stories, whether it was Rolls-Royce or Siemens or Alstom or whoever, about, having to compete with Chinese firms coming into the country for infrastructure deals. And then, eventually either winning or losing, depending on whether you were able to take give holidays to officials or whatever. That was just the expected way of doing business in a country like that. I guess what you're saying is that this has improved over time, right? Like, at one point, Siemens' Asian business was its own fiefdom. It was paying bribes. It ended up paying a huge FCPA fine. And that what you're saying is after that, it got better, right?
Well, I spent some time competing against Siemens when I was at GE. You mentioned Bangkok. Siemens had 100% market share in the light rail, and we were all over those contracts, and they were clean, and it was just damn good leadership in market. I'm not saying it's easy, but it worries me when I hear this sort of cynical, defeatist attitude. There are countries where you just can't do business unless. And I think the record shows otherwise. There are plenty of good, I wrote a little piece called Tillerson is Right. Even Exxon would turn down bribe requests. And it worries me a little bit when you don't have people from the business community who actually can do it right and can testify.
Was it before China came into the picture? What's the impact of China?
Terrible. They're very tough.
That's what he would.
And it's hard.
Yeah. No, because people are saying this also about Africa, because China has gotten so much into that. And so
there are things you can do, collective action if you get the other bidders in a tender to cooperate. There are things you can do.
Yeah.
It's a very good point, and things definitely improved in Southeast Asia since I've been living there, which is the early 90s. But if we go back to what's going on with the FCPA, right, the suspension of new cases, that just lessens, companies are always operating in a gray area, right? Where, look at Sons and Daughters program, JPM, right? They hired these kids of Chinese officials, and the quid pro quo, in my view, on that was not that clear. They didn't. It wasn't like, oh, we'll hire your daughter or son and we'll get. But would a bank do that now?
They used to do it in New York. They had a floor they called the kindergarten, where they had important children who were given jobs. And this is a long-standing practice. It's not good. But the other side of that story is they self-reported. They went, they figured it out and they've self-reported, which I think is the sort of key to all this. But I'm not going to support. God, what the current administration is doing is criminal. Pausing this is just appalling. You're right.
Yeah. So if you're sort of like trying to make partner at a bank in Asia, and you're right up against the gray line, you're just more likely to tip onto the other side, which is, oh yeah, we'll hire this kid or whatever. That stuff was happening all the time. By the way, TPG hired Najib's daughter at the time of all of the 1MDB stuff, right? So.
Oops. So how is, I listen to your podcasts and, get your newsletter, Whale Hunting, it's called. Billion Dollar Whale, you like the word whale. So tell us about your business a little bit.
Yeah, so we put out podcasts under the Brazen banner. We have a deal with Vanity Fair where we do magazine articles. We had an article a couple of weeks ago in Vanity Fair about a British failed actress who conned Hollywood. It's like it's the serial squatter story, of when you can't get people out of houses in California. She was the ultimate version of that. She was able to, and she conned, the top casting director in Hollywood, the top real estate agent in Hollywood. So we do stories like that about kind of amazing con people, I think, like in the Inventing Anna kind of realm. I'm currently working on a story called White Boy, which is about a guy who became a leader of the Bloods, but he was a Caucasian, while being a high school lacrosse coach. So it's like, the more you get involved in true stories, the more you realize that you don't really need to make stuff up. It's extraordinary what happens. And, you know, in Hollywood as well, there's a huge appetite for these kinds of stories as a basis for TV shows and films and also documentaries. So, you know, that's what we're doing. We still do a little bit of journalism through our whale hunting newsletter, which you can sign up for free. You know, we actually broke the news that Kushner had taken $2 billion from the Saudis after leaving office after the first Trump administration. So we do, you know, we do break news as well still, but we're not really, you know, we're still journalists, but we just don't do as much of full-time journalism. We're more a production company now. There's just sort of an unending stream of stories you can find, and I guess that goes back to why I've got a slightly cynical worldview.
Rick, you had a question.
You know, I think you may have written the story about the grand piano that Jolo gave to the, yeah? And I think it's a nice story. It illustrates some of the challenges of recovering stolen assets. Maybe you could tell those who don't know this rather, you know, amusing and sad story, I guess, in the end, about the grand piano and the girlfriend.
Yeah, so Jolo ended up dating Miranda Kerr, who was a supermodel, Victoria's Secret supermodel. And I think at the time when he dated her, the #2 best paid model in the world after Gisele Bündchen. She had dated James Packer before Jolo, the Australian billionaire. And she was looking to IPO her skincare line, Cora Organics. She sort of met him in a midtown Korean restaurant one night in New York. And they ended up dating. And he showered her with gifts like he did with lots of people. And Jolo would touch people and just, you know, change their lives. So people who would meet him on a casino floor in Vegas. I mean, it's called $1 Billion Whale because he's the largest casino whale ever, right? He would give people $50,000 chips, you know, chips worth $50,000 for no reason. And for Miranda Kerr, she got like a lot of
what's 50,000?
Yeah. Exactly. It's like peanuts, right? Which is why it's so strange they didn't pay off the guy who wanted a few million, who ended up stealing their computer servers and breaking the whole story open. We never got an answer to why that happened. But yeah, Miranda Kerr got jewelry. And then she got this piano for her Malibu home. It was a Perspex grand piano. So I guess you could see through it to all its inner workings. Incredibly expensive. And so large that they had to build the room in the Malibu home on the clifftop around the piano. So when the Department of Justice added it to its list of seized assets under its civil forfeiture lawsuit, they couldn't remove the piano without destroying the house. And so Miranda Kerr got to keep her Perspex piano. There was no way for them to get it out. So that basically that piano will forever.
But she's holding it in trust. She's holding it in trust. Tell us this story. I don't know this part. She's holding it in trust for when the department determined that it would cost more to sort of cut down the house in order to take the piano. And then moving this piano, right? The piano maker himself said, you can't move this piano without lots of careful workmen because it's, you know, tuned and so forth. So the department, someone told me from the department, they have a trust agreement with her. She's the trustee for a piano that's been seized by the Department of Justice. And, you know, are they going to put it in main justice, you know, on the floor? They don't quite know what to do. And I was told she also posed on the piano for an ad, right? What was one of those high-end women's magazines, right? Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
It's to do that? Make money off it.
Well, she was the trustee. She could, you know.
Wow.
Oh, I mean, there's some amazing stories about what people have done subsequently. There's no shame in Hollywood. The Kardashians just partied on Jolo bought a $250 million yacht at the very end of all of this. It was later seized by the DOJ in Bali with the Indonesian authorities, and is now owned by a Malaysian company that rents it out for partying. And the Kardashians have partied on it and did Instagram photos from it. even though Kim Kardashian was given a white Ferrari by Jolo for her first marriage, the marriage that lasted, a matter of weeks, and never returned that white Ferrari. So there's all these assets that people didn't return to the Malaysian people, who, by the way, are still, we didn't mention this, but they're still paying interest on the bonds that Goldman raised, which is equivalent of like 600 schools built. They could build every year in Malaysia.
We might actually.
I was going to say Swizz Beatz, Alicia Keys' husband. The Malaysian government is suing him to get money back. He was paid millions to just hang out with Jolo and MC events for him and stuff like that.
So the bottom line is, with all of the recovery or whatever, I mean, the Malaysian people still suffer the consequences.
Yeah, well, that's the problem with white collar crime, right? Like it's a little hard to get people to care about the victims often, but if you ask yourself why are these countries we've been talking about, why are they caught in the middle income trap, with GDPs per capita of like, I don't know, under $10,000, it's partly because of the venal nature of their leaders, aided and abetted by Western interests, banks, law firms, the big four, all of those guys that make it happen.
Yeah, so it's too bad for these countries, but then how come we're helping and people in our countries are making a lot of money off of that? That's the part that's disturbing, I would say. I think we probably need a glass of wine. John wants to ask a question. We still have 2 minutes. Oh, and Jennifer. Okay, so quick.
Thanks. Just a quick question, and I'd also very much recommend Tom's podcast, Whale Hunting. It's a brilliant series. A question: what has the Malaysian government done to recover its billions of dollars that were lost due to this scandal? What have they done to recover it, and how's it going? I mean, how much have they recovered? What's the process? Just an idea on that.
Yeah, so they've recovered about 6 billion. So that they've recovered a lot actually. 1MDB still exists as a corporate entity, and it's hired Kroll, the global investigations firm, and it's Kroll that's trying to get people like Swizz Beatz to pay them back some of the millions they were paid for doing nothing by Jolo. So yeah, the DOJ under the kleptocracy initiative seized about 1.7 billion in assets. This is like, actually it was the lawsuit was called the US versus the Wolf of Wall Street, the film. So a lot of that's gone back. Obviously the huge fines from Goldman, fines from other banks, and so yeah, they've made money back, but they still have to pay the bonds, the coupon and the principal. So, but yeah, they've got money back.
Okay, quick, Jennifer.
Hey Tom, it's Jennifer Taub. Nice to finally see you. I have a question
for
you. I have a question for you about the process of making this film, and of course, as a law professor, thinking about prospects of defamation, or sort of being at the edge of wanting to talk about why some of these folks took this money, whether blindfold, whether they were willful blindness. In other words, Leonardo DiCaprio, for example, is kind of Hollywood.
The movie is about Fat Leonard.
Oh, it's Fat Leonard. It's not about IMDb. Okay.
Well, I'll answer very quickly. Why did Jolo?
If you wanted to make a movie about this book, or you've been talking about this, why isn't there more attention in public about?
Yeah. What about a movie from one?
Yeah.
We are making a movie about $1 billion whale as well. By the way.
Oh. Okay. So.
Yeah, it's getting written by the guy who wrote War Dogs with Jonah Hill, and yeah, you have to. I mean, will Leonardo DiCaprio play himself or not? That's the question that everybody is. Well, I mean, there's a film. I know we're out of time, but very, very quickly, Molly's Game is a film about Tobey Maguire and his gambling habits, and Tobey Maguire is played in that movie by Jesse Eisenberg, and everyone knows it's Tobey Maguire. So there's a way of doing stuff like that. In terms of defamation, I mean, we already wrote the book. It's 400 and something pages. Nobody sued us, so I think,
I guess I'd ask one little. How close are you going to go in a film that's going to have more impact to suggesting that they knew that this was money that was supposed to go to the people of Malaysia as opposed to this guy's own fortune?
Well, if you're talking about DiCaprio specifically, I think that guy just hangs around with Russian billionaires all the time and is used to getting stuff for free. So, it's quite plausible deniability for him to say, well, I get a lot of stuff for free. I'm Leonardo DiCaprio. Swiss Beats, I mean, he never faced legal indictment or anything, but I think, he'd be hard pressed to explain why he accepted billions of dollars for doing nothing. And he even did it after stories had come out about Jolo, right? So the stories are out in the media, and these guys are still enjoying hanging out with him and taking his money. So in terms of a fictionalized version of this, you don't have to make up too much for it to be pretty shocking.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thanks.
Thank you.